Okay, good afternoon and welcome. This is the UCCS Speaker Series. For those of you who don't know, UC Center Sacramento is an educational and research dissemination arm of the entire University of California system. And one of our missions is to share knowledge that's produced on the campuses of the University of California, all 10 campuses actually, in the interest of supporting better public policy. So we're particularly pleased to be co-sponsoring this event in partnership with the UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. And before I call on their team to introduce today's speakers, I'd like to thank Judith Katz, the Director of Advancement at that center, for her help in organizing this event. And I'm very pleased to introduce Louise Bedford, who's the Executive Director of CLEE, Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, who will introduce today's speakers.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Louise Bedsworth, Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, or CLEE. CLEE is a policy research center that really helps to link the expertise of Berkeley Law, the broader campus, and our partners to help develop pragmatic policy solutions to some of our most pressing and environmental challenges. We work at the intersection of law, policy, and we do training for students and recent college graduates to really promote real-world solutions to some of our most vexing environmental problems. We draw on the expertise of staff and students and many other partners to do our work. With a keen focus on implementation and how do we take the policies that we have in place, particularly here in California, and demonstrate how we can effectively and equitably implement them so that they can be scaled and replicated. We hold a regular Lunch and Learn series, primarily online, and we're really excited to partner with the UC Center Sacramento to bring some in-person events to Sacramento to share some of the topics that we are working on and thinking about how we can advance policy solutions. Our Lunch and Learn series is made possible by a number of our partners, including Wilson Sonsini, Oric, and Hanson Bridget, and through our Ideas to Action Fund, which one of our donors has created for us, we've been able to bring this in-person event here to Sacramento. So we really appreciate all of you joining us in person and online. Today, I'm really excited that we're going to be tackling a topic that is critically important as we think through the state's path to decarbonization and broadly the nation and the world's path, and that is how are we going to decarbonize the heavy-duty vehicle sector. We've been working at CLEE on this topic with the California Air Resources Boards and partners around the world to think about how we tackle this challenge, and we have two wonderful experts today to help us think about that. So I'm excited to introduce Ray Minhares, who's the Heavy Duty Vehicles Program Director at the International Council on Clean Transportation, with over 20 years of experience in environment, energy, and transportation policy. He oversees more than 24 research staff to support deployment of zero-emission trucks and buses in Europe, North America, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, and South Africa. And so we are thrilled, Ray, thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here. And then he will be followed by Ethan Elkind, who's the director of our climate program at CLEE, where he also leads the Climate Change in Business Research Initiative, which is a collaboration between UC Berkeley and UCLA Law Schools. He's taught at the UCLA Law School. He is also a regular host of the weekly call-in show State of the Bay on KALW, and is also the host of CLEE's podcast called Climate Break, which shares short and inspiring climate solutions, and encourage you all to tune in to that regularly as well. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ray.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Louise, for that introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here at the UC Center today. I'm a proud graduate of UCLA and UC Berkeley, and it's just a real joy to be able to give back to my fellow alumni. So I'm going to introduce this topic today on decarbonization of heavy-duty vehicles. First, I wanted to say a little bit about the organization that I represent, the International Council on Clean Transportation. We're a nonprofit international research organization originally created by regulators of vehicle emissions and vehicle energy. So these regulators brought together a core research team to help them identify the world's international best practices to really address the climate and health impacts of all modes of transportation. And so for that reason, we bring what we believe is that policy set that regulators can utilize to best address the climate and health impacts of vehicle emissions. So taking that perspective and applying that to transportation writ large, it's important to recognize when we consider the challenge that climate change presents, that zero-emission vehicles really are the most important policy lever and technology solution to meeting those decarbonization goals. This graphic is an illustration of a transportation carbon budget that the ICT has produced and published, showing that through 2050, the baseline set of cumulative CO2 emissions from all transportation activity is about 285 gigatons. But that's far more than what we can afford to produce if our goal is to stay within a 2-degree temperature target. That amount would be just 210 billion tons. And there's even less that we can afford to emit if we're aiming for a lower target down to 1.5. The ICT, let's say, has little confidence at this point that we can feasibly achieve the 1.5-degree budget for the transportation sector. But that 1.7 is still within reach. And you can just see the range of measures that are available to us, with ZEV sales being the largest of those. Now, when we talk about heavy-duty vehicles, we're talking about the category of vehicles that are doing the work and moving the people around. This is a very broad set of vehicle types. I'm showing here just 3 examples with tractor trailers, which are perhaps the most familiar form that you see on the roads today, but it's important to recognize we're also talking here about school buses and transit buses. We're talking about refuse trucks. We're also talking about delivery vans and delivery trucks, moving vans. Ambulances are considered a part of this category. Snowplows. The EPA has estimated there could be over 100 different types of medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So it is a challenge in actually being able to produce solutions for such a broad range of vehicle types. But one thing that's very exciting to report is that out of all of these vehicle types, we actually have more than 200 commercially available zero-emission vehicles in the United States in the medium and heavy-duty space. Another really important recent development is the fact that the economics for electrifying these categories of vehicles are moving in the right direction. The business case is strong and getting stronger. And one illustration of that is when we look at battery electric long-haul trucks. Our finding is that those vehicles will reach TCO parity, that is total cost of ownership parity, with diesel trucks by 2029 in the United States, and by 2030 it will be the vehicle that will make the most sense to buy. We can't quite say that for hydrogen-powered trucks, and that might come as a surprise to some folks who have always considered hydrogen as the solution, especially for the long-haul truck segment. And that's because of the advantages that hydrogen provides in reducing the amount of time it takes to charge and fuel the vehicle. But in fact, the cost of battery-powered vehicles is coming down so rapidly that's going to allow us to afford more batteries on those vehicles to go longer distances. And we combine that with solutions like megawatt charging, that that combination of megawatt charging and falling battery prices really is going to lead to a scenario that's coming soon where hydrogen really will struggle to compete on a cost per mile basis with battery-powered vehicles. So that's exciting. But another thing that's exciting is the extent to which the industry that manufactures medium and heavy-duty vehicles is already investing in producing zero-emission vehicles. One analysis that we sponsored recently by colleagues at Atlas Public Policy illustrates that when we look at both the current production available today as well as the planned investments in production capacity for zero-emission trucks and buses, and the fact that manufacturers are already using production lines that can both produce zero-emission and internal combustion engine vehicles, that capacity is equal to 60% of the total market of sales of medium and heavy-duty vehicles nationwide. So all that to say that production capacity for zero-emission vehicles we don't see as a major constraint here. And that is, again, in part because the economic signals to invest in ZEVs are already there. Of course, whenever we're talking about zero-emission vehicles, and especially battery-powered ones, we have to consider how we're going to charge them. And so the ICCT has taken a look at the US in particular to identify where we need that charging deployed and by when. This is something that every utility needs to take into consideration to ensure that that charging capacity is available when a fleet buys its electric truck and really needs to install chargers. One takeaway that might be a surprise is that we actually don't need to build charging everywhere right away. And that has to do with the fact that the business case for battery-powered trucking is not equal everywhere, that some places show a stronger business case for electrification than others. And those places will tend to be where we have the highest freight activity, and that should be obvious. The places where we have ports, where we have industrial zones with warehousing, and where we have long-haul freight corridors. So California is really ground zero, and especially Southern California is ground zero for this. In fact, of the 3,000 plus counties that we assessed in this analysis, 4 of the top 10 are in Southern California. So that was LA County, Riverside County, San Bernardino, and San Diego counties. So anybody who regulates utilities in those places really needs to pay attention to this map and to the demand that's coming. Now, California has been a real innovator in driving the vehicles to market and in setting policies that I think it's fair to say represent the international best practices. So for those who actually are in California government and that are looking at what is it that California can be doing better, I could say that when we bring California's examples to other parts of the world, we actually start with we start with this list of policies, and they include setting clear goals and targets. They include setting clear fiscal policies like vehicle point of sale purchase incentives and the low carbon fuel standard. They include sales requirements. So this actually requires manufacturers of trucks to sell electric vehicles. And if they don't, they get penalized something like $50,000 per vehicle that they fail to sell. So it is delivering products into the market. It also includes infrastructure, and it's a combination of setting the right plans for the state and also actions by agencies like the Public Utilities Commission to take those plans, particularly from the California Energy Commission, and turning those sort of forecasts for energy need into authorizations for utilities like PG&E and Southern California Edison to actually build new substations and deploy more transformers and feeder lines. At the federal level, another key policy is the Inflation Reduction Act, which, independent of what California is doing, we think is an incredibly powerful policy mechanism, because we find that by 2030, the incentives available through that legislation would enable as many as 1.1 million zero-emission Class 4 to 8 trucks on U.S. roads by 2030. That's 10% of all the medium and heavy-duty vehicles on U.S. roads, and by 2035, it could be up to 20%. So this is coming, and it's supported by policy. The last thing I wanted to leave you with here today is just where the U.S. currently sits with respect to other actors. And so here I'm illustrating what the trajectory is for California in terms of ramping up the share of total sales that are zero emission. And so the state has already set the requirement that by 2036, 100% of those medium and heavy duty vehicles be zero emission. There's no other government in the world that has set such an aggressive target. The European Union is close behind and not quite as aggressive as California is, but the US EPA is about to finalize their greenhouse gas standard, and we'll likely find out this month exactly what their stringency level is, but it's all of these policies combined and more still in countries that we're not talking about that are going to really deliver the full decarbonization that we need from this sector. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand it over to Ethan.
Thank you, Ray, for that overview. That was really helpful to just lay out the state of the technology and the policies. I'm going to tee off of Ray's comments and talk about some of the policies that we need to adopt to drill down on a few key areas to ensure we have this deployment of heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. And I'm going to give all of you a bit of a sneak preview of a report that will be coming out in a few months from now based on a series of convenings that we did. As Louise mentioned, we partnered with UCLA Law, and we partnered on a couple of roundtable discussions sponsored by Bank of America, so I want to give a shout out to the bank for supporting this initiative. Some roundtable discussions focused on two key issues. First, how do we get more of the heavy-duty charging infrastructure deployed? This is going to be a major barrier to adoption of the trucks because people aren't going to buy the trucks if they don't know that charging is available. And of course, the charging companies may not want to put the chargers in if they don't know the trucks are going to be there. So I think we all know what this is. It's a chicken and egg problem. So we need to make sure we get this deployment taken care of. And I'm going to talk about three of the key challenges related to the infrastructure deployment, which revolve around the need for more public sector planning, more utility planning, and bringing more resources, more capital investment to the infrastructure side. And then we did a second convening just a number of weeks ago at the Air Resources Board's headquarters down in Riverside, which if any of you have not had a chance to go and you're in the Riverside area, I highly recommend it. It's a pretty fascinating building where they do all the emissions testing. That's where they found the Volkswagen that was cheating, the $1 billion car. And that was just $1 billion for California that we got back. There was multi-billions over across the world. But the second convening in Riverside was focused on the financing. So, if we just take a step back, we are not requiring major new technologies here. We've had amazing progress done on batteries, on chargers, and as Ray mentioned, we expect cost decreases to continue. We expect continued improvement in charging technologies, but this really isn't a question of technology anymore. It's more a question of getting through just the basic practical barriers of deployment. And one of those is the financing. How do we marshal the capital resources into this sector? How do we get that investment in the trucks? How do we get that investment in the charging infrastructure? And so that was a focus of our second convening, was how do we unlock financing? And three of the challenges that I'm going to talk about in terms of how to address them include having uncoordinated design for these public sector programs, some of which Ray highlighted. And then secondly, the challenge around letting private investors know about what's going on with this technology, more education outreach to the investor community. And then lastly, one of the key barriers, which may not be obvious to people who don't work in this field, it wasn't to me until I was participating in that convening, is that we need more data on the resale value of these trucks. That's holding back a lot of the financing. So those are the two areas I want to talk about. And I don't have slides because we're still in the process of drafting this report, but hopefully all of you are on our mailing list at clee.berkeley.edu, and you'll be the first to know when it comes out, and you're getting, like I say, the sneak preview right now. So on the infrastructure side, we gathered a group of people from utilities to the financial investment community, to the automakers, to some of the charging companies themselves, some of the nonprofit advocates involved in this space, to tell us what do we need to do to improve deployment of the vehicle charging. And as Ray noted, we need to move towards megawatt level of charging. So there may be a bit of a false sense of security here because we've seen light-duty electric vehicles roll out, and we have a charging issue on those as well. But it's an order of magnitude more complicated when it comes to trucks. Because for many of these trucks, we're talking about needing essentially a megawatt charger per truck per day or per night. And that means these trucks need a place to park with a charger there. They need a charger that works. We need the utilities to make sure that we have enough power to these sites. It's just a question of deployment, deployment, deployment. How do we get this stuff going? And when we talk about utility deployment, I mean, for some of these sites, like down at the ports in Southern California, we're talking about maybe needing a new transmission line down to the port and the port adjacent areas to charge these trucks. And right now in California, typical planning to operation time for transmission is about 15 years on average. It's 10 in other states, but 15 years here. We don't have the time to wait if we really want to meet these goals. So this is an urgent question. And number one, the biggest challenge is that we need more public sector planning. And so some of the recommendations around the governor's office really taking a lead in elevating this issue of infrastructure deployment across all the major energy agencies, making sure that we have annual events for the energy agency leaders, the principals behind Energy Commission, Air Resources Board, Public Utilities Commission, setting clear goals as to deployment and making sure that there's accountability among the agencies. Are they coordinated? Because we do have a bit of a Byzantine kind of a governance structure when it comes to these issues. A lot of different cooks in the kitchen, and we need to make sure everyone's coordinated and has a clear direction about how to move forward. And then in addition, when there are challenges to deployment, when an individual utility project or bank of chargers are getting hung up by a lot of local processes or uncoordinated state processes, the governor's office creating a strike team, perhaps someone housed at the governor's office of business and economic development, GoBiz, one of my favorite acronyms, although CalGEM is another great acronym for a state agency, but that's an aside. So GoBiz could house someone who could basically help troubleshoot deployment, solve that issue, but not just solve that issue for that one spot, but do so in a way where that knowledge can be shared across the state. Because we don't want to have to keep reinventing the wheel on all of these challenges. We want solutions when it comes to a project that we can then scale and help increase deployment more broadly than just that project. So that's on the public sector planning. Second big challenge is, as I mentioned, on the infrastructure deployment is the need for more utility investments. And here we have another chicken and egg problem because utilities are monopolies, by and large. We have some municipal utilities, but particularly those ones in Southern California that Ray pointed out that are really in high need of deployment here. They are monopolies regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission, and for them to get approval by the regulators of investments in the infrastructure, the grid infrastructure, they have to be able to show that there's demand. But here it's hard to show demand when the trucks aren't quite yet in operation, and the trucks aren't going to get into operation until the charging is there. So we need to find ways to speed up the process of utility grid deployment. So some of that is on the utilities to be more transparent about what are the sources of delays on their part, particularly when it comes to what we call interconnection, or I think a lot of people now call it energization, which can sometimes take up to a year or more, a lot of costs on individual projects, just to get them basically the lights turned on, the juice flowing to these projects. But we also need to allow utilities to do things like pre-purchase some of the equipment, some of the grid equipment that they need, the transformers, et cetera, at the distribution level and on up. And basically pre-buy, have pre-approval from the regulators to be able to invest. And on the public sector side, we could be helping utilities with this. So one idea coming out of this discussion, for example, was Caltrans offering bulk permits to utilities to upgrade the grid for chargers along some of these Caltrans corridors to help move things along. So a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of utility planning and the processes that govern utilities so we get this electricity out there. Again, electricity isn't new, the grid isn't new, but we can't wait around for the old timelines, the delays, when we're trying to make a very rapid transition towards electrifying this entire sector. Now lastly, just on the question of infrastructure, we still need more capital to flow to these charging banks. And it's not even clear about the business model. I know there's some folks, I think, in this room who work on the charging infrastructure side of things, and I'm assuming they know there's a business model. But this is going to be an area that's going to require a lot of subsidies, especially in the beginning, to get this off of the ground. So there's a lot of discussion around the Air Resources Board potentially reusing or reauthorizing the low carbon fuel standard in a way that dedicates more funding to chargers specifically, and getting those going. And of course, the low carbon fuel standard, for any of you following this, it's undergoing proposed amendments right now. It's been delayed at the Air Resources Board. It's a bit controversial, but this is something advocates have been asking for. Can we take the money generated from the low carbon fuel standard off of high carbon fuels and plow that money into this zero emission technology, including the chargers? We also need to be thinking about electricity costs. For any of you who pay or the ones in your household who pay electricity bills, you may have noticed they've been skyrocketing. A lot of this is because of wildfire costs and liability that utilities have to shoulder in this state, I think disproportionately, although I'm not here to defend utilities, but we have a kind of a strange legal regime that puts all the costs on utilities, even though there's a lot of reasons why the wildfires have been as severe as they have been. But can we move some of these grid upgrade costs out of the rate base and into the general fund? Can we find ways to make it more equitable how we're paying for the investment that needs to go into the grid? And if we have things like a climate bond that has been talked about a lot here in the Capitol, could we incorporate grid upgrades, the needed grid upgrades for this kind of electrification, all the other electrification we need as well for buildings, into that kind of a bond to help pay for the infrastructure that we need? So a bit of a whirlwind. I don't have slides because it's all a preview. This is kind of secret stuff here. But I'm just verbalizing some of the solutions, and maybe during Q&A, if any of you have follow-ups on that, happy to talk. But I want to just pivot before I run out of time to the financing side. So I mentioned we also need to move capital into purchasing these trucks. These trucks are more expensive than diesel trucks right now by a fair amount. I mean, some of the numbers I've heard, $350,000 for a new battery-powered zero-emission truck, compared to maybe $100,000, $150,000 for a diesel truck. I could be wrong on those numbers. I'm not in the trucking business, but that's what I've heard. So that's a pretty big delta. And as Ray pointed out, we have strong incentives to help make up that delta. And ultimately, what we want to do is have some of the big fleets. So for example, we had Amazon, we had US Foods participating in our roundtable discussion on this. They have the money, they have the climate goals, the carbon reduction goals. They can, in some cases, with these incentives, buy the vehicles, and then the hope is that as these vehicles are now used, after a couple years, they'll be much more affordable to more of the sort of mom and pop truckers that would need to take advantage of them. So in the meantime, how do we get the capital markets to help finance those purchases? We know that we're heading towards a place where the total cost of ownership is going to be, as Ray pointed out, better or at least competitive with the diesel trucks. So how do we finance this transition in the meantime? And the state is doing a lot to support the financing of this, but there's more that could be done. When we heard from a lot of the people trying to access these state funds, the state incentives, they talked a lot about how uncoordinated they are. They're on different timelines. Just even things like getting the payments out from the incentives and the incentive programs is not seamless, is delayed, doesn't match the cash flow issues. The criteria is overly rigid in many cases. They mentioned things like even the regulations on scrapping older trucks, diesel trucks, which could then become, that becomes a new market for zero emission vehicles. Lack of flexibility on the retirement ages for those trucks and the buyouts to get those diesel trucks off the road and convert them into zero emission models. So a lot of discussion around the HVIP program, as Ray showed on the slide, the hybrid and zero emission truck and bus voucher incentive project. And no, I didn't memorize that. I had to read that. I feel like people who work in HVIP don't even know what HVIP stands for, but I just told you, so now you know. But relaxing the criteria on the HVIP program. There's strict limits on the fleet size, for example, how many you can get, and as well as some of the incentive amounts, and a lot more flexibility, and that could help potentially unlock more funding, at least coordinated with other funding that's available in the public sector. The second challenge I talked about was the need to get more outside investment into the financing space here. We don't want to just be relying on public funds. There should be a rate of return here that could attract private capital. So there was a lot of talk about how do we get ESG type investors. I know ESG is kind of a dirty word now. That's environmental, social, governance criteria. But a lot of companies need to meet internally set climate goals. There's a lot of investors that are trying to invest in climate-friendly technologies. This is a very ripe area to do so, but we need to do more to unlock that source of capital. And a lot of it is about education and outreach to that community. Just even explaining to them, they should just sit through Ray's presentation, really. Just explaining to them, what is the technology? What is the policy environment to try to support this technology? What are the high sort of return and high need markets in the country? There's just a lot of confusion and lack of knowledge in the investment community about this space because it's new. And so there needs to be more outreach. I think the Air Resources Board and other government agencies involved could help because they could gather some of the data. How are their programs working out? And communicating that to the investment community. And giving some of the nonprofits, like Ceres, for example, which works a lot with the investment community, arm them with the stories, the data that they need to be able to go talk to investors and explain what's happening. And getting some of the other sort of quasi-public sector investors, green banks, for example, around the country, and iBank here in California, getting them talking to investors and educating them so we can rely more on private capital and less so on public dollars, which are limited. Last but definitely not least, I do want to point out the final challenge on finance, which our group that we convened down at Riverside talked about, which was the resale data. What is the resale value? Then again, I'm not in the finance world, and so I was pretty surprised to hear this, but this is really holding back a lot of lenders in this space because they don't know what the truck's worth when it goes for sale. So if you're going to loan someone some money for the product, your loan terms are going to be based on the value of that asset. And if you have no idea what the value of that asset's going to be after 2 years of being driven around because that data, we don't have that data yet, that makes it really hard to access the capital up front. And so CARB is gathering that data, but trying to share that data, make sure that's out there for the investment community is going to be really important. But there were some interesting ideas at this convening around, can we take the data we do have on the light-duty electric vehicles? We know how those batteries perform, and heavy-duty vehicle batteries are basically just light-duty electric vehicles on steroids. It's just a bigger battery, and we know how those batteries perform in those applications. Can we use artificial intelligence, other modeling tools, to give a pretty good guess as to what's going to happen with these batteries to give us that resale value data, hopefully earlier. We could also do things to encourage the resale of these vehicles to start proving that the market is out there. So, for example, some of these public dollar incentives, like the HVIP program, which I'm not going to say what that stands for again. So the HVIP incentive program, can we put a bit of a condition on there that these vehicles have to be resold at a certain point in time, or maybe even for a certain value to really maximize the incentives, or an encouraging leasing that has a finite time period where there's a condition of sale after the lease is over. So we start to get that data accumulated, and that can help unlock a lot of financing. So I know that was a whirlwind. It was a big data download, a lot of solutions, but hopefully that's helpful in thinking about some of the nitty-gritty steps we need to take to boost infrastructure deployment and also to unlock more capital to really meet these goals, get that deployment out there as soon as we can, because it really is urgent for public health reasons and for climate reasons that we do this as soon as possible. So we need a strong effort here by all sectors within government and outside of government to make it happen. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over for closing remarks with Dr. Bedsworth.
Well, I just want to say Great, thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Ray and Ethan. This was a great conversation. Thank you to the UC Center for hosting us. This was really wonderful. We will be back actually as part of the UC Center series next month to talk about some work we've been doing on wildfire, and then again in May to talk about some light duty zero emission vehicle work that we have underway. So I'd love to have you join us for that, as well as our online Lunch and Learn series. I know Ethan gave a plug for signing up on our website, clee.law.berkeley.edu. But thank you all so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.